A black boy frantically calls 911 saying, "I can't wake mom up," his heart racing. But when the cops arrive, they uncover far more than a medical emergency, leaving them speechless. What dark secrets will be revealed? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Trevor's eyes fluttered open, his small body instantly alert. Something felt off. The house was too quiet, too still. Usually by this time he could hear his mom bustling about in the kitchen, the familiar clinking of dishes and the comforting aroma of breakfast filling the air. But today, there was nothing. A knot of worry formed in his stomach as he slipped out of bed, his bare feet padding softly on the cool wooden floor. "Mom?" he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. No response came. Trevor made his way down the hallway, his heart beating faster with each step. The silence pressed in around him, heavy and suffocating. As he approached his mother's room, the door stood slightly ajar. He pushed it open gently, peeking inside. "Mom?" he called again, his voice quivering. What he saw made his blood run cold. There, on the floor beside her bed, lay his mother, Jasmine. She was motionless, her dark hair spread out like a fan around her head. "Mom!" Trevor cried out, rushing to her side. He shook her shoulder gently, then more urgently. "Mom, wake up! Please, wake up!" But Jasmine didn't stir. Her skin felt cool to his touch, and no matter how much he pleaded, she wouldn't open her eyes. Panic surged through Trevor's small body. His hands shook as he fumbled for the phone on his mother's nightstand. With trembling fingers, he dialed 911, just as his mom had taught him to do in emergencies. The phone rang once, twice, and then a calm voice answered. "911, what's your emergency?" Trevor's voice came out in a frightened sob. "I can't wake Mom up. She's on the floor, and she won't move." The dispatcher's voice remained steady, a lifeline in Trevor's sea of fear. "Okay, sweetheart. You're doing great. Can you tell me your address?" Trevor rattled off their home address, his words tumbling out in a rush. He could barely hear his own voice over the pounding of his heart. "Good job," the dispatcher praised. "Now is your mom breathing? Can you see her chest moving up and down?" Trevor leaned close to his mother's face, straining to detect any sign of life. I don't know," he whimpered. "I can't tell. Please, you have to help her." "We're sending help right now," the dispatcher assured him. "Paramedics and police are on their way. Can you unlock the front door for them?" Trevor nodded, then remembered the dispatcher couldn't see him. "Yes," he whispered. "Okay, now stay on the line with me. Don't hang up. Can you hold your mom's hand?" Trevor reached out, his small fingers intertwining with his mother's limp ones. Tears streamed down his face as he held on tight, willing her to squeeze back, to open her eyes, to say something. Anything. In the distance, he could hear the wail of sirens growing louder. Help was coming, but to Trevor, it felt like an eternity. He sat there, holding his mom's hand, his world shrinking to this moment, this room, this overwhelming fear that threatened to swallow him whole. The wail of sirens grew louder, piercing the quiet morning air. Trevor's heart raced as he heard car doors slamming and hurried footsteps approaching the house. He reluctantly let go of his mother's hand and rushed to unlock the front door, his small body trembling with fear and anticipation. Two paramedics burst in, their faces serious but kind. "Where's your mom, buddy?" one of them asked gently. "This way," Trevor whispered, leading them to Jasmine's room. The paramedics immediately set to work, their movements quick and precise. They checked Jasmine's vital signs, speaking in hushed tones filled with medical terms Trevor couldn't understand. He stood in the corner, hugging himself tightly, watching with wide, tear-filled eyes. Officer Riley arrived moments later, his uniform crisp and his face etched with concern. He knelt down beside Trevor, placing a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder. "Hey there, son. I'm Officer Riley. Can you tell me your name?" "Trevor," he mumbled, his gaze never leaving his mother's still form. As the paramedics worked to stabilize Jasmine, Officer Riley's eyes scanned the room, taking in the details. His gaze fell upon a cluttered desk in the corner. Curious, he moved closer, noticing a pile of unopened bills and past-due notices. Beside them lay a stack of old photographs. Riley picked up one of the photos, his eyebrows rising in surprise. It showed a younger Jasmine, dressed in a smart suit, standing proudly in a courtroom. He flipped through more images, each depicting Jasmine in various legal settings, looking confident and successful. She was a lawyer, Riley murmured to himself, his voice tinged with disbelief. The paramedics overheard his comment and paused their work for a moment, glancing at the photos. The room fell silent as the gravity of the situation sank in. Here was a woman who had once stood at the top of her profession, now lying unconscious on the floor of a modest home, surrounded by unpaid bills. Trevor noticed the change in atmosphere. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice small and frightened. Officer Riley quickly set the photos down and returned to Trevor's side. "Nothing's wrong, buddy. We're just trying to understand more about your mom so we can help her better." The paramedics resumed their work with renewed urgency. "We need to move her now," one of them announced. They carefully lifted Jasmine onto a stretcher, securing her for transport. As they wheeled Jasmine out of the room, Trevor tried to follow, his face pale with worry. Officer Riley gently held him back. "They need space to work, Trevor. We'll follow them to the hospital, okay?" Trevor nodded numbly, watching helplessly as his mother was taken away. The sound of the ambulance doors closing echoed through the house, leaving behind a deafening silence. At the hospital, the stark white walls and antiseptic smell overwhelmed Trevor's senses. He clung to Officer Riley's hand as they approached the nurse's station. The kind-faced nurse directed them to a waiting area, promising to update them as soon as possible. Hours ticked by, each minute feeling like an eternity to Trevor. He sat quietly, his small frame hunched over in the uncomfortable plastic chair. Officer Riley stayed by his side, offering silent support and occasionally patting the boy's shoulder. Finally, a doctor in a white coat approached them. His face was serious, and Trevor's heart sank. "Are you here for Jasmine Wilso?" the doctor asked. Officer Riley nodded, standing up. "Yes, I'm Officer Riley, and this is her son, Trevor. How is she?" The doctor's expression softened as he looked at Trevor. "I'm sorry to say that your mother is in critical condition. We're doing everything we can for her." Trevor's eyes filled with tears. "Can I see her?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The doctor hesitated, glancing at Officer Riley. "I'm afraid that's not possible right now. We need to keep her in intensive care where we can monitor her closely." Officer Riley knelt down to Trevor's level. "I know you want to see your mom, buddy, but the doctors need to help her get better first. We have to be patient, okay?" Trevor nodded, a tear rolling down his cheek. Officer Riley stood up and pulled the doctor aside, speaking in hushed tones. Trevor strained to hear their conversation, catching words like uncertain and serious condition. As the reality of the situation began to sink in, Trevor felt a wave of fear wash over him. What if his mom didn't get better? What would happen to him? He was only 10. He couldn't imagine life without her. Officer Riley returned, his face etched with concern. "Trevor, I need to talk to you about something important," he said gently. "While your mom is getting better, we need to make sure you're taken care of. There's a nice lady named Ms. Bailey who's going to look after you for a little while. Is that okay?" Trevor's lower lip trembled. "But what about Mom? I want to stay here with her." "I know you do, buddy," Officer Riley said softly. "But your mom would want you to be safe and cared for while she's getting better. Ms. Bailey is really nice, and she'll bring you to visit your mom as often as possible." Just then, a kind-faced woman with curly hair approached them. "Hi, Trevor. I'm Ms. Bailey," she said warmly. "I heard your mom isn't feeling well. I'm here to help take care of you until she gets better." Trevor looked from Ms. Bailey to Officer Riley, feeling lost and overwhelmed. He wanted to be brave, like his mom always told him to be, but the thought of leaving the hospital without her made his heart ache. Ms. Bailey seemed to sense his distress. She knelt down beside him, her voice gentle. "I know this is scary, Trevor, But we're all here to help you and your mom. You're not alone in this." Trevor nodded slowly, trying to hold back his tears. As Ms. Bailey led him out of the hospital, he couldn't help but look back, hoping to catch a glimpse of his mother. The corridors seemed endless, each step taking him further away from her. In the car, Trevor stared out the window, his mind swirling with worry and confusion. He didn't fully understand how sick his mom was, but he knew it was bad. Still, a small flame of hope flickered in his heart. His mom was strong, she had to get better, she just had to. As Trevor settled into Ms. Bailey's care, Officer Riley returned to Jasmine's small apartment. The space felt heavy with untold stories and unspoken struggles. He stood in the living room, taking in the scene before him. Piles of unopened envelopes littered the coffee table, their edges curling with age. Officer Riley picked one up, his heart sinking as he read the bold red letters stamped across it. Final notice. He sifted through the stack, finding more unpaid bills and even an eviction notice. "How did it come to this?" he muttered, shaking his head. His eyes scanned the room, landing on a cardboard box tucked away in the corner. Curiosity piqued, he made his way over and carefully opened it. Inside, he found a treasure trove of memories and accolades. Officer Riley pulled out a framed newspaper article, its headline proclaiming, "Rising Star Attorney Jasmine Wilso Wins Landmark Case." The photo showed a younger Jasmine, her smile radiant and eyes filled with determination. He read on, learning about her passionate defense of a wrongfully accused man and her dedication to justice. Digging deeper, he uncovered more articles praising Jasmine's legal prowess and commitment to social justice. Awards and certificates of recognition filled the box, testifying to her once illustrious career. "My God," Officer Riley whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She was at the top of her game. As he carefully replaced the items, a small photo album caught his eye. He opened it gently, revealing pictures of Jasmine with a man he assumed was Trevor's father. They looked happy, their love evident in every snapshot. But as he flipped through the pages, the man's presence faded, leaving only Jasmine and a baby Trevor. Officer Riley's mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle of Jasmine's life. How had someone so accomplished, so driven, ended up in such dire straits? What had happened to cause such a drastic change in her circumstances? He stood up, his heart heavy with the weight of this newfound knowledge. The contrast between the successful lawyer in those articles and the struggling single mother he'd encountered today was stark and troubling. As he prepared to leave, Officer Riley's gaze fell on a small, framed photo of Jasmine and Trevor. Despite the visible signs of hardship, their smiles were genuine, their love for each other evident. It was a reminder that behind every case, every statistic, there were real people with real stories. As news of Jasmine's collapse spread through the community, neighbors began to talk in hushed tones. Mrs. Smith, who lived next door, stood on her porch, shaking her head sadly as she spoke to another neighbor. "Such a shame," Mrs. Smith said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jasmine always kept to herself, but you could tell she loved that boy, something fierce." The other neighbor nodded. "I heard she used to be some big-shot lawyer. Gave it all up to raise her son, from what I understand." As the days passed, more stories began to surface. People recalled seeing Jasmine walking Trevor to school every morning, rain or shine. Others remembered her working odd jobs to make ends meet. Meanwhile, Trevor found himself in Ms. Bailey's care, staying at her cozy home while his mother remained in the hospital. He couldn't help but notice how Ms. Bailey treated him with extra gentleness, her eyes often filled with a sadness he couldn't quite understand. One evening, as they sat at the kitchen table eating dinner, Trevor looked up from his plate. "Ms. Bailey," he said quietly, "do you know something about my mom that I don't?" Ms. Bailey paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. She set it down slowly, her face softening as she met Trevor's gaze. "What makes you ask that, sweetie?" Trevor shrugged, pushing his peas around his plate. "You just seem, I don't know, extra nice to me, like you're worried or something." Ms. Bailey reached across the table, placing her hand gently on Trevor's. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm just trying to take good care of you while your mom gets better, that's all." But Trevor could sense there was more. He'd always been good at reading people, a skill his mother had praised him for. Is she going to get better?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ms. Bailey took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Trevor, your mom is very sick. The doctors are doing everything they can to help her, but—" She paused, squeezing his hand gently. "We need to be prepared for the possibility that she might not recover." Trevor felt his heart drop, a cold fear spreading through his chest. "But she has to get better," he said, his voice rising. "She's all I have." Ms. Bailey moved her chair closer, wrapping an arm around Trevor's shoulders. "I know, sweetie. I know it's scary. But no matter what happens, you're not alone. We're all here for you." Trevor leaned into Ms. Bailey's embrace, tears silently rolling down his cheeks. As he sat there, surrounded by the warmth of Ms. Bailey's care, he couldn't help but wonder what would happen if his mom didn't come home. The thought was too big, too frightening to fully comprehend, but it lingered there, a shadow at the edges of his mind. As Trevor sat in Ms. Bailey's living room, his eyes fixed on the ticking clock on the wall, his mind wandered to the stories his mother had told him about his father. The room felt too quiet, too still, as he waited for any news about Jasmine's condition. He closed his eyes, remembering his mother's warm voice as she spoke of his dad. "Your father was a kind and brave man, Trevor," she'd often say, her eyes shining with pride and a hint of sadness. "He fought for justice as a civil rights attorney, standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves." Trevor's chest swelled with pride at the thought of his father's work. He imagined a tall, strong man in a suit, standing in a courtroom, his voice ringing out as he defended those in need. But that pride was always mixed with a deep sadness, a hollow ache for the man he'd never really known. And Jasmine had always been open about his father's illness, but Trevor realized now that she'd shielded him from the full details. He knew his dad had died when he was very young, too young to have any real memories of him. But the stories his mom shared made him feel like he knew his father, at least a little. "Your dad would be so proud of you," Jasmine would tell him, ruffling his hair. "You have his kind heart and his sense of justice." Trevor felt tears prick at his eyes as he thought about his mom lying in the hospital bed. He wished his dad was here now, to hold his hand and tell him everything would be okay. But he wasn't, and now his mom was fighting her own battle against illness. A fierce determination welled up inside Trevor. He might not have been able to stand by his father's side during his illness, but he could be there for his mom. He would be brave, just like his dad had been in the courtroom. He would be kind and strong like both his parents had taught him to be. "I'll make you both proud," Trevor whispered to the empty room, his small hands clenching into fists. "I'll be here for Mom, just like she's always been here for me." As he sat there, feeling both small and somehow stronger than he'd ever felt before, Trevor made a silent promise to himself and to his parents. He would face whatever came next with courage, honoring the legacy of the father he'd never known and standing by the mother who'd given him everything. The next day, Ms. Bailey gently placed a hand on Trevor's shoulder, her eyes filled with concern. "Trevor, sweetheart, can we talk for a moment?" she asked softly. Trevor nodded, his heart beating a little faster. He could sense something important was coming. They sat down on the couch, Ms. Bailey turning to face him. She took a deep breath, her voice gentle but serious. "Trevor, there's something I need to tell you about your mom. It might be a bit hard to hear, but I think you're old enough to understand." Trevor's eyes widened, his body tensing. "What is it? Is she going to be okay?" Ms. Bailey hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Your mom. She's been sick for a while now, longer than anyone knew. She kept it a secret from everyone, even you." Trevor felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "What? But how? I didn't know. I didn't see." "I know, sweetie," Ms. Bailey said, her voice full of empathy. "Your mom worked very hard to hide it. She didn't want anyone to worry, especially you." Trevor's mind raced, thinking back to all the times his mom had seemed tired or had gone to bed early. He'd thought she was just working hard, but now... "But why didn't she tell me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ms. Bailey squeezed his hand gently. Your mom loves you very much, Trevor. She wanted to protect you, to keep you from worrying. She thought she could handle it on her own. Tears welled up in Trevor's eyes as the reality of the situation hit him. His mom, his strong, brave mom, had been fighting a battle all alone. She'd smiled through her pain, laughed through her exhaustion, all to keep him happy and carefree. Is that why we don't have much money? Trevor asked, suddenly connecting the dots. Because she couldn't work as much? Ms. Bailey nodded sadly. That's part of it, yes. Your mom had to cut back on work, and medical bills can be very expensive. Trevor felt a mix of emotions swirling inside him. Sadness, fear, but also a deep, overwhelming love for his mother. He thought about how she'd always made sure he had everything he needed, even when things were tight. How she'd never complained, never let on that anything was wrong. She's so brave, Trevor whispered, a tear rolling down his cheek. Yes, she is, Ms. Bailey agreed, her own eyes misty. And now, Trevor, she needs us to be brave for her. Can you do that? Trevor nodded firmly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. I can. I will. I'll be brave for Mom, just like she's always been brave for me. As Trevor sat with Ms. Bailey trying to process the overwhelming news about his mother's illness, a soft knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Officer Riley poked his head in, his expression serious. Ms. Bailey, could I have a word with you? He asked quietly. Ms. Bailey nodded, giving Trevor's hand a reassuring squeeze before stepping out into the hallway. Trevor watched as they moved a short distance away, speaking in hushed tones. Despite their efforts to be discreet, Trevor could still make out bits of their conversation. While I am looking for any family relatives' numbers so I can inform them on Jasmine's situation, I found some old letters, Officer Riley was saying. Seems Jasmine's parents cut her off years ago. Trevor's ears perked up at the mention of grandparents he'd never known existed. He leaned forward, straining to hear more. Ms. Bailey's voice was filled with shock. Cut her off? Why? Apparently, they didn't approve of her marriage, Officer Riley explained. Her husband, Trevor's father, was a civil rights attorney. Not wealthy enough for their taste, it seems. Trevor's heart sank as the pieces began to fall into place. He had grandparents, but they had abandoned his mother just because she fell in love with his dad? The thought made his stomach churn. They chose money over their own daughter? Ms. Bailey's voice was thick with disbelief. Officer Riley nodded solemnly. The letters suggest they gave her an ultimatum, them or him. Jasmine chose love. Trevor felt a mix of emotions wash over him. Pride in his mother's choice, anger at his grandparents' cruelty, and a deep sadness for the family connection he'd never had the chance to experience. As Ms. Bailey and Officer Riley continued their hushed conversation, Trevor's mind raced. He thought about how his mother had always told him that love was the most important thing in the world. Now he understood just how much she had sacrificed for that belief. The adults re-entered the room, their faces etched with concern. They found Trevor sitting very still, his young face a mask of hurt and confusion. You heard us, didn't you, buddy? Officer Riley asked gently. Trevor nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. I have grandparents? Ms. Bailey sat beside him, her arm around his shoulders. Yes, Trevor. But sometimes even grown-ups make big mistakes. Your grandparents made a very big one when they turned their backs on your mom. All because she loved my dad? Trevor's voice cracked with emotion. Officer Riley knelt in front of Trevor, his eyes full of compassion. Your mom chose love over everything else, Trevor. That's a very brave and beautiful thing. Trevor felt tears welling up in his eyes again, but this time they were mixed with a fierce pride. His mom had given up so much, her family, her wealth, her career, all for love, for his dad, for him. Trevor sat quietly, his small hands clasped tightly in his lap as he tried to process the information about his grandparents. Ms. Bailey and Officer Riley exchanged worried glances, unsure of how to comfort the young boy. Trevor, Ms. Bailey began gently, I know this is a lot to take in. It's okay to feel upset or confused. Trevor looked up at her, his eyes brimming with tears. "But why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would they do that to Mom? To me?" Officer Riley knelt down in front of Trevor, his face filled with compassion. "Sometimes, buddy, grown-ups make decisions based on fear or things they don't understand. Your grandparents were afraid of change, and they let that fear guide their choices. But that doesn't make it right," Trevor said, a hint of anger creeping into his voice. Ms. Bailey nodded. "You're absolutely right, Trevor. It wasn't fair or right. But I want you to remember something very important." She paused, making sure she had Trevor's full attention. "Their choices don't define who you are or how much your mom loves you." Trevor thought about this for a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Mom always said that love was the most important thing," he said slowly. "And she was right," Officer Riley agreed. "Your mom chose love over everything else. That's incredibly brave." As Trevor pondered these words, a small spark of determination began to grow inside him. He might not have grandparents who wanted him, but he had a mom who loved him more than anything in the world. And right now she needed him to be strong. "I won't let them make me feel bad about myself," Trevor declared, his voice growing stronger. "Mom wouldn't want that." Ms. Bailey smiled, giving Trevor's shoulder a gentle squeeze. "That's the spirit, Trevor. You're showing incredible strength, just like your mom." The next day, Ms. Bailey took Trevor to visit his mother in the hospital. As they walked down the sterile hallway, Trevor felt a mix of excitement and fear. He was eager to see his mom, but scared of what he might find. When they entered the room, Trevor's breath caught in his throat. His mother lay still on the bed, surrounded by beeping machines. Her usually vibrant face was pale and peaceful, showing no signs of waking. Can I hold her hand?" Trevor asked hesitantly. Ms. Bailey nodded encouragingly. "Of course you can, sweetie. Go ahead." Trevor approached the bed slowly, carefully taking his mother's hand in his own. It felt warm, and he could feel her pulse beneath his fingers. Even though she couldn't respond, Trevor began to talk to her, telling her about his day and how much he missed her. As he spoke, Trevor felt a new resolve growing within him. He might not be able to change his grandparents' minds or wake his mother up, but he could be the kind of person she had raised him to be. Strong, loving, and full of hope. Officer Riley sat at his desk, surrounded by a stack of papers and old newspaper clippings. He rubbed his tired eyes, determined to uncover the truth about Jasmine's past. The more he dug, the more his heart ached for the young mother and her son. After hours of phone calls and searching through public records, Riley finally managed to track down Jasmine's estranged parents. The Harringtons were a wealthy couple living in an exclusive gated community on the other side of town. As he drove to their residence, Riley couldn't help but wonder how such a seemingly successful family could have fallen apart. When he arrived at the Harrington estate, Riley was struck by the stark contrast between the opulent mansion and Jasmine's modest apartment. He rang the doorbell, and after a moment, a stern-faced woman answered. "Mrs. Harrington?" Riley asked, showing his badge. "I'm Officer Riley. I'd like to speak with you about your daughter, Jasmine." The woman's face hardened. "We have nothing to say about Jasmine," she said coldly, moving to close the door. Riley quickly put his foot in the doorway. "Please, Mrs. Harrington, your daughter is in the hospital, and your grandson needs help." At the mention of a grandson, Mrs. Harrington's expression flickered with surprise, but she quickly masked it. "Come in," she said reluctantly. Inside, Riley met Mr. Harrington, who seemed equally unwilling to discuss Jasmine. But as Riley pressed for information, the story began to unfold. "Jasmine was brilliant," Mr. Harrington said, his voice tinged with regret. "She was on track to become one of the youngest partners at her firm. We had such high hopes for her." Mrs. Harrington chimed in, her tone bitter. "But then she met that man, a penniless civil rights lawyer with grand ideas but no future." Riley listened as the Harringtons described how Jasmine had fallen in love with Trevor's father, a passionate advocate for social justice. They had tried to discourage the relationship, warning Jasmine that she was throwing away her promising career. We gave her an ultimatum, Mr. Harrington admitted. Us or him. She chose him. And you cut her off completely? Riley asked, struggling to keep the judgment out of his voice. Mrs. Harrington's eyes flashed. She made her choice. We weren't going to support her while she threw her life away on a lost cause. As Riley left the Harrington estate, his mind was reeling. He now understood the depth of Jasmine's sacrifice. She had given up wealth, status, and family for love. But in doing so, she had lost her safety net, leaving her and Trevor vulnerable when tragedy struck. Officer Riley returned to the hospital, his heart heavy with the knowledge he'd gained. He found Trevor sitting quietly in the waiting room, his small hands clasped tightly in his lap. Riley knelt down beside the boy, his voice gentle. "Trevor, I've got some news," he said softly. "I found your grandparents." Trevor's eyes widened, a mix of hope and fear flickering across his face. "Really? Are they coming?" Riley nodded. "They've agreed to come and see your mom. They want to meet you too." Trevor's heart raced. He'd never known he had grandparents. Maybe they could help. Maybe they'd love him and his mom. But as the minutes ticked by, his excitement gave way to nervousness. When the Harringtons arrived, Trevor's breath caught in his throat. They looked so fancy, like people from a TV show. Mrs. Harrington's eyes swept over him, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Hello?" Trevor said shyly. "I'm Trevor." Mr. Harrington gave a curt nod. "Yes, well, where's Jasmine?" Officer Riley led them to Jasmine's room, Trevor trailing behind. The boy's heart sank as he watched his grandparents. They didn't smile at him or try to hold his hand. They didn't even look at him. In the room, Mrs. Harrington gasped at the sight of Jasmine lying pale and still in the hospital bed. For a moment, her cold facade cracked, and Trevor saw a flicker of pain in her eyes. "Oh, Jasmine," she whispered. Mr. Harrington cleared his throat. "What exactly is wrong with her?" As the doctor explained Jasmine's condition, Trevor inched closer to his mother's bed. He wanted to hold her hand, to feel connected to her. But before he could reach out, Mrs. Harrington's sharp voice cut through the room. "This wouldn't have happened if she'd listened to us," she said, her tone bitter. "We told her marrying that man would ruin her life." Trevor froze, his hand hovering over his mother's. He looked up at his grandmother, confusion and hurt swirling in his chest. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice small. Mr. Harrington sighed heavily. "Your mother made a mistake, boy. She threw away everything for a man who couldn't provide for her." "My dad was a hero," Trevor said, his voice trembling. "Mom always said he fought for what was right." Mrs. Harrington's laugh was cold and harsh. "A hero? He was a fool who dragged our daughter down with him." Trevor felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. He looked from one grandparent to the other, searching for any sign of warmth or acceptance. But all he saw was disappointment and anger. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though he wasn't sure what he was apologizing for. The Harringtons barely glanced at him. They spoke in low voices with the doctor, ignoring Trevor completely. The boy felt smaller than he ever had before, invisible in the very room where his mother lay fighting for her life. Officer Riley watched the scene unfold, his heart breaking for Trevor. He saw the moment the light of hope died in the boy's eyes, replaced by a deep, aching loneliness. The Harringtons wasted no time in taking charge of the situation. Mrs. Harrington's voice was crisp and authoritative as she addressed the hospital staff. "We want Jasmine moved to a private room immediately," she demanded, "and arrange for a private nurse to care for her around the clock." As the hospital staff scrambled to fulfill their requests, Trevor stood by, feeling small and invisible. He watched as his mother was wheeled away to a new room, his grandparents following closely behind without so much as a glance in his direction. Ms. Bailey placed a gentle hand on Trevor's shoulder. "Are you okay, sweetie?" she asked softly. Trevor couldn't find the words to respond. His chest felt tight, and his eyes burned with unshed tears. He had hoped for a warm embrace, for someone to tell him everything would be all right. Instead, he felt more alone than ever. In the waiting room, Trevor sat silently, His shoulders slumped. Ms. Bailey tried to comfort him, her voice soothing and kind. "Trevor, I know this is hard," she said. "Sometimes people don't react the way we hope they will, but that doesn't mean you're not loved." Trevor looked up at her, his eyes filled with confusion and hurt. "They don't even want me," he whispered. "Mom always said family was the most important thing, but they don't think I'm family." Ms. Bailey's heart ached for the boy. She wished she could shield him from this pain, but she knew she couldn't. "Your mom loves you more than anything in this world," she said firmly. "That's the family that matters most." But Trevor's mind was racing. If his grandparents had rejected his mother for marrying his father, what else didn't he know? He thought about all the stories his mom had told him, about their happy little family. Now he wondered how much of it was true. What if everything Mom told me was a lie? Trevor's voice cracked as he spoke. "What if we're not really the family I thought we were?" Ms. Bailey shook her head. "No, Trevor, your mom's love for you is real. That's something you can always count on." But the seed of doubt had been planted. Trevor's world, which had already been shaken by his mother's illness, now felt like it was crumbling around him. He had always been proud of his parents, of their love story and his father's work. Now, he didn't know what to believe. As the day wore on, Trevor sat quietly, lost in his thoughts. He tried to hold on to hope, to remember the warmth of his mother's hugs and the sound of her laughter. But the cold rejection of his grandparents kept creeping back in, leaving him feeling more alone than he had ever felt before. Officer Riley couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Jasmine's story. He felt a deep sense of responsibility towards Trevor, who reminded him of himself at that age, lost and alone. With determination in his eyes, Riley decided to dig deeper into Jasmine's life. Over the next few days, Riley spent his free time talking to people in the community. What he discovered left him in awe. Despite her own struggles, Jasmine had been a beacon of hope for many. At the local women's shelter, the director's eyes lit up when Riley mentioned Jasmine's name. "Oh, Jasmine. She's been an angel to us," the woman said, her voice filled with warmth. "She comes in twice a week to help our residents with legal advice, never asks for a penny." Riley's investigations led him to a small community center, where he met Sarah, a young woman in her early 20s. "Ms. Jasmine changed my life," Sarah told him, her eyes brimming with tears. "I was ready to drop out of school, but she mentored me, helped me believe in myself. Now I'm in college studying to be a social worker." As Riley pieced together the puzzle of Jasmine's life, he was struck by her selflessness. Here was a woman who, despite facing her own battles with illness and financial hardship, had dedicated herself to lifting others up. One afternoon, Riley made his way to the hospital. He found Trevor sitting quietly by Jasmine's bedside, holding her hand. The boy looked up as Riley entered, a small spark of hope in his eyes. "Hey, buddy," Riley said gently, pulling up a chair next to Trevor. "How's your mom doing today?" Trevor shrugged, his eyes falling back to his mother's still form. "The doctors say she's stable, but she still hasn't woken up." Riley nodded, his heart heavy for the boy. He glanced at Jasmine, then back at Trevor. "You know, I've been learning a lot about your mom," he said softly. Trevor looked up, curiosity peeking through his sadness. "Yeah?" Riley smiled. "Yeah. Did you know she's been helping out at the women's shelter? And mentoring young people in the community?" Trevor's eyes widened slightly. "She never told me," he whispered. "Your mom's pretty amazing, Trevor," Riley said, his voice filled with admiration. "She's been going through a tough time, but she never stopped helping others." As Officer Riley finished sharing his discoveries about Jasmine with Trevor, he noticed movement at the door. Jasmine's parents stood there, looking uncertain and a bit uncomfortable. Riley's eyes widened, recognizing them from the photos he'd seen in Jasmine's apartment. "Mr. and Mrs. Harrington?" he asked, standing up. Trevor's head snapped around, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. Riley stepped towards them, his voice low but firm. "I'm glad you're here. There's something you need to know about your daughter." He led them a few steps away from Trevor, who watched anxiously. Riley spoke quietly but passionately, telling them about Jasmine's volunteer work, her mentoring, and the lives she'd touched. As he spoke, he saw their expressions change from skepticism to surprise, and finally to something that looked like awe. "She gave up everything," Mrs. Harrington whispered, her voice shaky, "but she never stopped giving to others." Mr. Harrington's face was a mix of emotions. "We thought she'd thrown her life away," he said softly, "but she was building something beautiful." They turned to look at Trevor, who quickly looked away, pretending he hadn't been watching. Mrs. Harrington took a hesitant step towards him. "Trevor?" she said gently. "Would it be okay if we talked to you for a bit?" Trevor looked up at Riley, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Okay," Trevor said quietly. As Riley stepped out to give them privacy, he saw the grandparents sitting down near Trevor. Mrs. Thompson reached out, almost touching Trevor's hand before pulling back. "Can you tell us about your life with your mother?" Mr. Harrington asked, his voice gentle. Trevor, still wary, began to speak. He told them about movie nights with his mom, how she always made time to help with his homework even when she looked tired. He shared stories of their small but happy Christmases, and how Jasmine never missed a school event. As Trevor spoke, his grandparents listened intently. Their faces softened, and Mrs. Harrington wiped away a tear. "She sounds like a wonderful mother," she said softly. Trevor nodded, a small smile on his face. "She's the best." Mr. Harrington leaned forward. "Trevor, we'd like to hear more. Can you tell us about your favorite memory with your mom?" That evening, as Trevor sat quietly in the hospital waiting room, Officer Riley approached him with a gentle smile. He took a seat next to the boy, his eyes filled with warmth and understanding. "Trevor," Officer Riley began softly, "I've been doing some digging, and I found out more about your father's work. Would you like to hear about it?" Trevor's eyes lit up with curiosity. He nodded eagerly, leaning forward in his chair. Officer Riley took a deep breath and started to share what he had learned. "Your father was a civil rights attorney. Do you know what that means?" Trevor shook his head, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Well," Riley continued, "it means he fought for people who were treated unfairly because of the color of their skin or where they came from. He stood up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves." Trevor's eyes widened with awe. "He did that?" Riley nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "He sure did. Your dad took on tough cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch. He helped people who couldn't afford fancy lawyers get justice." As Riley spoke, Trevor felt a warmth growing in his chest. He had always known his father was a good man, but hearing about his work made him feel proud in a way he'd never experienced before. "Your dad's work wasn't easy," Riley went on. "He didn't make a lot of money, and sometimes people didn't like what he was doing. But he kept going because he believed in what was right." Trevor's mind raced with questions. Is that why Mom's parents were mad at her? Because Dad didn't have money? Riley nodded slowly. "That's part of it. Your mom came from a wealthy family, but she chose to marry your dad because she believed in him and his work. She knew it would be hard, but she loved him and believed in what he was fighting for." Trevor sat back in his chair, taking it all in. He thought about his mom's struggles, the unpaid bills he'd seen, and how she always made sure he had what he needed, even when times were tough. "Mom gave up a lot for Dad, didn't she?" Trevor asked quietly. Riley placed a gentle hand on Trevor's shoulder. "She did, but I don't think she ever regretted it. Your parents chose love and justice over money and an easy life. That's something to be very proud of." Trevor felt tears welling up in his eyes, but for the first time in days, they weren't tears of sadness or fear. He felt a new sense of pride washing over him. Pride in the parents who had sacrificed so much for what they believed in. "I want to be like them," Trevor said, his voice filled with determination. "I want to help people too." Officer Riley smiled warmly. "I think you're already on your way, Trevor. Your parents would be so proud of how brave and strong you've been through all of this." As Trevor sat there thinking about his parents' legacy, he felt a new strength growing inside him. He might not have a lot of money or a big family, But he had something far more valuable: the example of two people who had chosen love and justice above all else. The next day, Trevor walked into the hospital room, his heart pounding with a mix of hope and fear. The steady beep of machines filled the air as he approached his mother's bed. Ms. Bailey stood nearby, offering a reassuring smile. As Trevor reached for Jasmine's hand, her eyelids fluttered. Slowly, they opened, revealing her warm brown eyes. Trevor's breath caught in his throat. "Mom?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Jasmine's gaze focused on her son, and a weak smile spread across her face. "Trevor," she said softly, her voice hoarse from disuse. Tears welled up in Trevor's eyes as he squeezed his mother's hand. "Mom, you're awake." Jasmine struggled to sit up, but Ms. Bailey gently eased her back down. "Take it easy, Jasmine," she said kindly. Jasmine looked at Trevor, her eyes filled with love and regret. "I'm so sorry, baby," she whispered. "I should have told you about my illness." Trevor shook his head, remembering all he had learned about his mother's sacrifices. "It's okay, Mom. I understand. You were trying to protect me." Jasmine's eyes glistened with tears. "I didn't want you to worry. I thought I could handle it on my own." Trevor leaned in closer, his voice strong and clear. "Mom, I love you, and I'm so proud of you. I know about all the good things you've done, even when things were tough." Jasmine looked at her son in wonder, touched by his words. She was about to respond when something caught her eye. She turned her head slowly, her gaze moving past Trevor to the other side of the bed. There, standing with tear-filled eyes, were her parents. Jasmine's eyes widened in shock. "Mom? Dad?" she whispered, disbelief coloring her voice. Trevor watched as his grandparents moved closer to the bed. They looked different now, their faces etched with remorse and love instead of the cold rejection he had seen before. "Jasmine," her mother said, her voice choked with emotion. "We're so sorry. We've been such fools." Her father nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Can you ever forgive us?" he asked. Without a word, Jasmine held out her arms. Her parents rushed forward, enveloping her in a tight embrace. Trevor found himself pulled into the hug as well, surrounded by the warmth of his family. "We're sorry," Jasmine's parents repeated, their words muffled by tears and embraces. "We were wrong, so terribly wrong." As they all cried together, Trevor felt a surge of hope. Maybe, just maybe, their family could heal after all. As the family embraced, the room filled with a mixture of tears and soft laughter. Trevor watched in awe as his mother, despite her weakened state, found the strength to forgive her parents. Jasmine's mother, her face lined with regret, gently held her daughter's hand. "We were so wrong, Jasmine," she said, her voice quivering. "We let our pride and prejudice blind us to what truly matters." Jasmine's father nodded, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "When we heard about your illness and all the good you've been doing in the community, we realized how foolish we've been," he added. Trevor stood quietly by the bedside, taking in this unexpected turn of events. He remembered the cold rejection he had felt from his grandparents just days ago, and now here they were, asking for forgiveness. Jasmine looked at her parents, her eyes filled with a mix of pain and love. She took a deep breath before speaking. "Mom, Dad," she said softly, "I won't pretend that your rejection didn't hurt me deeply. It did. But holding on to that pain won't change the past." She paused, gathering her strength. "I forgive you," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "Life is too short to hold grudges, and I want Trevor to know his grandparents." At the mention of his name, Trevor felt all eyes in the room turn to him. His grandmother reached out a tentative hand. "Trevor, we owe you an apology too," she said. "We were wrong to reject you before we even knew you. Can you give us a chance to make it right?" Trevor looked at his mother, seeking guidance. Jasmine nodded encouragingly, a small smile on her face. I think I'd like that," Trevor said hesitantly. Jasmine beamed at her son, pride shining in her eyes. "That's my boy," she whispered. As Trevor watched his mother extend forgiveness to her parents, he felt a warmth spreading through his chest. He realized that his mother was teaching him one of the most important lessons of his life: the power of forgiveness. As the days passed, Jasmine's condition slowly improved. The doctors worked tirelessly, and with each passing day, her strength returned bit by bit. Trevor spent every moment he could by her side, holding her hand and sharing stories of their life together. Finally, the day of Jasmine's discharge arrived. Trevor could hardly contain his excitement as he helped his mother into a wheelchair. His grandparents stood nearby, their faces a mix of concern and relief. "Are you ready to go home, Mom?" Trevor asked, his voice filled with hope. Jasmine smiled up at him, her eyes tired but warm. "More than ready, sweetie," she replied. As they made their way through the hospital corridors, Trevor pushed the wheelchair while his grandparents walked alongside. The group moved slowly, mindful of Jasmine's still fragile state. When they reached the hospital entrance, Trevor's grandfather went ahead to bring the car around. As they waited, Trevor's grandmother rested a gentle hand on Jasmine's shoulder. "We're so glad you're coming home, dear," she said softly. Jasmine reached up and patted her mother's hand. "Thank you, Mom. It means a lot to have you here." The car pulled up and Trevor's grandfather got out to help Jasmine into the vehicle. With careful movements, they settled her into the back seat, Trevor climbing in beside her. As they drove through the city streets towards Jasmine's apartment, an uncomfortable silence fell over the car. Trevor's grandparents exchanged worried glances as they took in the gradually changing scenery. The neat, well-maintained buildings gave way to more run-down structures. Graffiti-covered walls and boarded-up windows became more common. Trevor, used to the neighborhood, didn't notice the change, but his grandparents' expressions grew increasingly concerned. When they finally pulled up in front of Jasmine's apartment building, Trevor's grandfather let out a small gasp. The building was old and worn, with peeling paint and a rusty fire escape zigzagging up the side. "This is where you live?" Trevor's grandmother asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jasmine nodded, a hint of embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "It's not much, but it's home," she said quietly. As they helped Jasmine out of the car, Trevor's grandparents took in their surroundings with wide eyes. The reality of Jasmine and Trevor's situation was finally sinking in. "How long have you been living here?" Trevor's grandfather asked, his voice gruff with emotion. Since Trevor's father passed away," Jasmine replied, her voice catching slightly. Trevor watched as his grandparents exchanged a look of shock and guilt. It was clear they were only now beginning to understand the true extent of what Jasmine had been through. As Jasmine's parents took in the stark reality of their daughter's living situation, a profound silence fell over them. The peeling paint, the creaky stairs, and the cramped apartment told a story of struggle they had never imagined. Tears welled up in Mrs. Harrington's eyes as she looked at her daughter and grandson. Mr. Harrington cleared his throat, his voice thick with emotion. "Jasmine, Trevor, we had no idea. We've been so blind." Jasmine smiled weakly, leaning on Trevor for support. "It's okay, Dad. We've managed." "No, it's not okay," Mrs. Harrington interjected, her voice firm. "We let our prejudice cloud our judgment. We abandoned you when you needed us most." Mr. Harrington nodded in agreement. "We were wrong, so terribly wrong. Can you ever forgive us?" Jasmine reached out and took her parents' hands. "I already have," she said softly. "We want to help," Mr. Anderson declared. "We'll do whatever it takes to make things right. You and Trevor shouldn't have to struggle like this anymore." Mrs. Harrington knelt down in front of Trevor, her eyes brimming with tears. "We've missed out on so much of your life, sweetheart. If you'll let us, we'd like to be a part of it now." Trevor looked up at his mother, who nodded encouragingly. "I'd like that," he said quietly. The next day, as Jasmine was settling back into her apartment, there was a knock at the door. Trevor opened it to find Officer Riley and Ms. Bailey standing there, both wearing warm smiles. "We just wanted to check in on you both," Officer Riley said as they entered. Ms. Bailey added, "And to see how you're doing, Jasmine. It's wonderful to see you home." Jasmine, seated on the couch, smiled gratefully. "Thanks to both of you. We couldn't have gotten through this without your help." Trevor nodded enthusiastically. "You guys were amazing. Thank you for taking care of us." Officer Riley and Ms. Bailey shared the events that had transpired while Jasmine was in the hospital, from their investigation into her past to their efforts to support Trevor. As they finished their update, Jasmine asked Officer Riley if she could speak with him privately. They moved to a corner of the small apartment. "I know what you did," Jasmine said softly. "Contacting my parents, helping them understand. You're the reason for our family reunion." Officer Riley looked surprised. "I just wanted to help," he said modestly. Jasmine smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. "And you did, more than you know." She gestured to Trevor, who was approaching with 2 freshly baked pies. "It's not much, but we wanted to thank you and Ms. Bailey. We baked these for you." Trevor handed 1 pie to Officer Riley and the other to Ms. Bailey, beaming with pride. "Mom's secret recipe," he said. "It's the best pie you'll ever taste." In the weeks that followed, a new rhythm settled into Jasmine and Trevor's life. The small apartment, once a symbol of their struggles, now buzzed with renewed energy and hope. Jasmine's parents, the Harringtons, became frequent visitors. They would often arrive with bags of groceries or new clothes for Trevor, their eyes shining with the joy of reconnection. Mr. Harrington would sit with Trevor, helping him with his homework, while Mrs. Harrington bustled about the kitchen, filling the air with the aroma of home-cooked meals. "We've missed out on so much," Mrs. Harrington would say, her voice tinged with regret. "But we're here now, and we're not going anywhere." Jasmine, true to her word, began taking her health seriously. She had regular appointments at the hospital, often accompanied by Trevor or her parents. The doctors were optimistic about her progress, and with each visit, Jasmine seemed to grow stronger. Despite her ongoing recovery, Jasmine never faltered in her devotion to Trevor. Every morning, she would wake up early to prepare his breakfast before school. Trevor would enter the kitchen to find a plate of warm pancakes or a bowl of his favorite cereal waiting for him, along with his mother's loving smile. "Eat up, sweetheart," Jasmine would say, ruffling his hair. "You need your strength for school." The neighbors, who had long admired Jasmine's quiet strength, now rallied around her. Mrs. Johnson from next door would often stop by with a pot of soup or a freshly baked casserole. Mr. Lee from across the hall would bring over fruits from his small garden. "It's not much," they would say, echoing Jasmine's own words of generosity from the past. "But we hope it helps." Word of Jasmine's situation had spread through the community, reaching many of the people she and her late husband had helped over the years. Former clients began to visit, each with a story of how Jasmine or her husband had changed their lives. One afternoon, a middle-aged woman named Maria arrived at their door, her eyes brimming with tears. "You might not remember me," she said to Jasmine, "but your husband helped me win custody of my children when no one else would take my case. I've never forgotten your kindness." These visits filled Trevor with a sense of pride. He had always known his parents were special, but hearing the stories of lives they had touched made him realize just how extraordinary they truly were. As news of Jasmine's story spread through the legal community, it reached the ears of her former colleagues at Goldstein and Associates, the prestigious law firm where she had once been a rising star. The partners were moved by her selfless dedication to her son and her continued commitment to justice, even in the face of personal hardship. After much discussion, the firm decided to honor Jasmine's legacy in a way that would make a lasting impact. They announced the establishment of the Jasmine Wilso Scholarship for Single Mothers-in-Law, aimed at supporting women who, like Jasmine, were balancing the demands of parenthood with their aspirations in the legal field. On a crisp autumn morning, a small ceremony was held in the firm's conference room to officially launch the scholarship. Trevor, dressed in his best shirt and tie, sat beside his mother, his chest swelling with pride. Jasmine, though still recovering, looked radiant in a simple blue dress, her eyes shining with emotion. Mr. Goldstein, the firm's founding partner, stood at the podium, his voice filled with warmth as he addressed the gathered crowd. "Jasmine Wilso exemplifies the very best of our profession," he said. Her unwavering commitment to justice, her resilience in the face of adversity, and her dedication to her family are an inspiration to us all. As Mr. Goldstein unveiled a plaque bearing Jasmine's name and the details of the scholarship, Trevor felt tears welling up in his eyes. He looked up at his mother, who was dabbing at her own eyes with a tissue. "Mom," Trevor whispered, squeezing her hand, "they're honoring you, just like you and Dad always honored others." Jasmine smiled down at her son, her heart full of love and gratitude. "We did what was right, Trevor. And now, this scholarship will help other mothers do the same." After the ceremony, well-wishers surrounded Jasmine and Trevor. Former colleagues shared stories of Jasmine's brilliance in the courtroom, while recipients of her pro bono work expressed their heartfelt thanks. Trevor listened intently, soaking in every word, every story that painted a picture of the incredible woman his mother was. As they prepared to leave, Mr. Goldstein approached them one last time. "Jasmine," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we've missed your passion and dedication. When you're ready, there's always a place for you here." Jasmine thanked him graciously, her eyes meeting Trevor's. In that moment, Trevor saw a spark of determination in his mother's gaze, a glimpse of the formidable attorney she once was and could be again. On a peaceful Sunday morning, Trevor and Jasmine made their way through the quiet cemetery, hand in hand. The autumn leaves crunched softly beneath their feet as they approached the familiar gravestone. Trevor carried a small bouquet of wildflowers picked from their neighbor's garden with permission. As they reached the grave, Jasmine knelt down, her fingers tracing the engraved letters of her husband's name. Trevor placed the flowers gently at the base of the stone, then stood close to his mother, his small hand resting on her shoulder. "Hey, love," Jasmine said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "We've come to tell you about everything that's happened lately." Trevor watched as his mother began to recount the events of the past few days. She spoke of her collapse, the fear and uncertainty that followed, and the unexpected reunion with her parents. Her voice trembled slightly as she described the scholarship established in her name. "Can you believe it, darling?" Jasmine said, a tear rolling down her cheek. "People still remember the work we did together. They're honoring us, honoring the values we fought so hard for." Trevor listened intently, his heart swelling with pride and a bittersweet longing for the father he never knew. Jasmine continued, her voice growing stronger. "I want you to know that I'm still carrying the torch, my love. Everything you taught me about justice, about standing up for what's right, it's all still here." She placed a hand over her heart. Turning to Trevor, Jasmine smiled through her tears. "And I promise you, I'm passing on your legacy to our boy. Trevor is growing into a young man who would make you so proud." Trevor felt a lump form in his throat. He stepped forward, placing his hand on the cool stone of his father's grave. "Hi, Dad," he said quietly. "I wish I could have known you. But Mom tells me stories about you all the time. I'm trying to be brave and kind just like you were." Jasmine wrapped an arm around Trevor's shoulders, pulling him close. "Your father's spirit lives on in you, Trevor. His courage, his compassion. I see it in you every day." They stood there for a while, the gentle breeze rustling the leaves around them. In that moment, surrounded by the peace of the cemetery and the memory of his father, Trevor felt a sense of connection to his family's legacy that he had never experienced before. As Trevor and Jasmine walked home from the cemetery, hand in hand, the young boy's mind was swirling with thoughts. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions and revelations, and now, in the quiet of the afternoon, Trevor found himself reflecting on everything he had learned. He thought about his mother's unwavering love and the sacrifices she had made for him. Jasmine had given up her prestigious career, faced rejection from her family, and battled a serious illness, all while shielding Trevor from the harsh realities of their life. Her strength and selflessness amazed him. Trevor's thoughts then turned to his father, a man he had never known but whose legacy loomed large. He had been a champion for justice, fighting for the rights of others even when it meant personal hardship. Trevor felt a swell of pride knowing that he came from such noble roots. The boy also pondered the unexpected kindness he had experienced from strangers. Officer Riley, Ms. Bailey, and even his neighbors had stepped up to help when they were in need. Their compassion had shown Trevor that family wasn't just about blood relations. As they neared their apartment, Trevor's mind wandered to his grandparents. Their initial rejection had hurt deeply, but their eventual return and request for forgiveness had taught Trevor a powerful lesson about the importance of forgiveness and second chances. Squeezing his mother's hand, Trevor looked up at her with newfound admiration. He realized that the true meaning of family wasn't just about shared DNA, but about the people who stood by you through thick and thin. His family might be small, but it was filled with love and supported by a community that cared. In that moment, Trevor made a silent vow to himself. He would carry on the legacy of kindness, justice, and love that his parents had built. He would face challenges with the same courage his mother had shown, and fight for what was right just as his father had done. Trevor understood now that his life, though not always easy, was rich with love and purpose. The sacrifices his parents had made had given him a foundation of strength and compassion. As he and Jasmine climbed the stairs to their apartment, Trevor felt a sense of peace wash over him. He knew that whatever the future held, he would face it with the values his parents had instilled in him, honoring their legacy with every step he took. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the city, Trevor found himself in a moment he never thought possible. He stood in the living room of their small apartment, surrounded by love and the promise of a brighter future. Jasmine's parents, now fully reconciled with their daughter, stood before Trevor and Jasmine. The elderly couple's eyes were filled with tears of regret and hope. Trevor's grandfather, his voice trembling with emotion, spoke first. "Jasmine, Trevor," he said, reaching out to hold their hands. "We've made so many mistakes, and we can never fully make up for the time we've lost. But we promise from this day forward we'll be here for both of you, no matter what." Trevor's grandmother nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "We want to be the family you deserve," she added softly. "If you'll have us." Jasmine, her face a mix of joy and disbelief, looked down at Trevor. The young boy felt a surge of emotions, happiness, relief, and a touch of uncertainty. But as he met his mother's gaze, he saw nothing but love and reassurance. Trevor took a deep breath and stepped forward. I'd like that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. In that moment, the barriers of the past seemed to crumble. Jasmine's parents enveloped Trevor and Jasmine in a warm embrace. Tears flowed freely as years of hurt and misunderstanding gave way to forgiveness and hope. As they pulled apart, Trevor noticed the change in his mother's face. The worry lines that had etched themselves into her features over the years seemed less pronounced. Her smile, always warm but often tinged with sadness, now radiated pure joy. The family moved to the small dining table where a simple but hearty meal awaited them. As they settled in, the atmosphere shifted from emotional to lighthearted. Stories were shared, laughter echoed through the apartment, and Trevor found himself experiencing a kind of familial warmth he had never known before. Throughout the evening, Trevor couldn't help but marvel at the change in his grandparents. They listened intently to Jasmine's stories of her work in the community, their faces shining with pride. They asked Trevor about school and his interests, genuinely eager to get to know their grandson. As the night wore on, Trevor realized that the love he felt wasn't just about blood relations or shared history. It was about understanding, forgiveness, and the choice to be there for one another. He thought about the community that had rallied around them in their time of need, and now, the family he never thought he'd have. Looking around the table, Trevor felt a sense of completeness he had never experienced before. The warmth of family, both old and new, surrounded him. He knew that challenges might still lie ahead, but for the first time he truly believed they would face them together. If you enjoyed the story of Officer Riley, Jasmine, and Trevor, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.